Rami G. Khouri is a Palestinian-American academic and journalist whose family resides in Beirut, Amman, and Nazareth. During his 50 years as a journalist in the Middle East, he was editor of the Jordan Times and the Daily Star newspapers and contributed reporting and opinion pieces from the region to the Financial Times, NPR, BBC Radio, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, and other outlets. Rami founded and managed the Issam Fairs Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut, where he also taught journalism for a decade. He's been a Harvard Nieman Journalism Fellow and a Senior Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School and a Fellow of the Palestinian Academy Society for the Study of International Affairs in Arab East Jerusalem. Rami is currently a Distinguished Fellow at IFI, a Senior Fellow at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and a regular contributor to Al Jazeera Online. Rami Khouri's latest book, co-edited with Helen Coben, is entitled Understanding Hamas and Why That Matters. Please give Rami a warm Zoom welcome. Rami?
Thank you very much, Janet, and thank you to Middle East Peace Now for organizing this, and I'm happy to be with you, share some thoughts. You've got to be a little bit nuts to talk about Hamas in the United States these days, given the intense sentiments that surround Hamas, the whole Gaza enterprise, the question of Israel's policies, and other related issues. And it's very difficult to have a serious, orderly and useful discussion about this, but this is what I've tried to do all of my life. I started to be engaged in Israeli-Palestinian interactions, let's call them, from my days in college. I went to Syracuse University in 1966 as a freshman, and then the '67 war happened, and immediately at the end of my freshman year, I started getting asked to, being one of the few Palestinians there and a journalist, so I used to write things. People asked me to debate with the B'nai B'rith students or the Hillel students or people in Syracuse, pro-Israeli people. And of course I did that, even though I wasn't, deeply politically engaged at that age, but it's just something that people do instinctively when your identity is in some turmoil. You have to do something about it. And when your identity is being totally denied by other people, which was our case in Palestine, and remains to some extent, if you look at the attempts in the US to criminalize activity by Palestinians or advocates of Palestinian rights or advocates of a peaceful negotiated solution that gives both people equal rights, they're being denied public spaces. They're being criminalized in many ways. So and this is being done not just by freak extreme groups, being done by the U.S. Congress, passing laws that will possibly deny universities tax-free status, or civil society groups deny them tax-free status if they do something like allow Palestinian groups to speak out or use certain terms. I mean, it's just outrageous what's going on. But this has been going on for the last century. And this is the first point I want to make, which is that, but just to finish my first thought. So I've been involved in this issue of engaging with Israelis and pro-Israeli groups in the West for really the last almost 60 years of my life. And I've learned a lot. And I've learned that the most important thing is to keep the discussion going. And it's not just a discussion, it's a negotiation. When you engage with people who disagree with you and who deny your rights and who want to make you invisible, you're negotiating not just the resolution of a political dispute, you're working on affirming your existence as a political person and a part of a political national cause. So I learned a lot doing this, and I've been to Israel many times. I have many close Israeli friends. I have many other Israelis who are not friends, but who I've engaged with seriously, and politicians. Even occasionally, I'll find myself in an academic or some other debate with a settler, and which I welcome, because you make peace with your enemies. You don't make peace with your friends. So we need to talk to people who we disagree with, and now we're at the most intense moment of this dynamic. So the first thing to keep in mind is that any discussion of Gaza today, or Israel, or anything related to Hezbollah, any of these issues, any discussion has to start with the acknowledgement that this is the latest and most severe phase of a political and military and cultural battle that has been going on for 100 years. If you don't accept that this is part of a 100-year struggle, then there's no reason to talk to each other. You just go and watch baseball, go watch football, whatever year it is, soccer. And I say 100 years war because it was almost exactly 100 years ago. In 1923 was when the British mandate for the land of Palestine was formalized by the League of Nations. And Britain took control of the land and immediately, formally acknowledged or asserted that one of its missions was to prepare for a Jewish homeland or a state in that land, which then in 1923 was around 93% Palestinian owned and inhabited. There was a small Jewish community there, had always lived there for hundreds and hundreds of years. But the idea of the world's greatest imperial power formally supporting a small movement, the Zionist movement, then to create in this majority Palestinian land a Jewish homeland and a Jewish state was rather outrageous. But in colonial terms, that's what they did. That's what colonialism did. It did not recognize the rights of ordinary people, in the South especially. And it moved people around, it changed borders, it created countries, it did whatever it wanted. But that's the beginning of the what I call the conflict between Zionism, or if you want to call it Jewish Zionism, that's a kind of repeating, because Zionism is the movement for a homeland for the Jewish people. But it's the conflict between Zionism and Palestinian Arabism. It's grown into an Arab-Israeli conflict with other people involved. So this is the first point to recognize, that this conflict has been going on politically, militarily, and other ways for about 100 years. The Israelis succeeded, the Zionists succeeded beyond any of their expectations to create their Israeli state. The Holocaust, Nazism in Europe speeded up the process by which large numbers of Jews left Europe and to save their lives and went to Palestine. Partly they went to Palestine because the racist governments in the United States and Great Britain would not accept them. They wanted to go to Great Britain and the United States, but there were even laws passed not to accept more Jewish immigrants there. So a few got in, but most of them didn't, and therefore the immigration really expanded, and the Jewish population of Palestine grew and grew, and a conflict erupted locally between them, starting really in the late 1920s, early 1930s. You started to have intercommunal Palestinian Arab versus Jewish Zionist military clashes and bombings and attacks. And that was the beginning of the military phase of this 100-year conflict. And it's gone on ever since. And it's only gotten worse. It's only gotten more intense, as we see in Gaza and October 7 and other incidents. It's brought in a lot of other people. And there's many dimensions to it, which I'll get to in a minute. But I want to start with this to situate Hamas. And my talk is about why we should understand Hamas. and I should, and what Hamas is and how people should deal with it. I should also clarify that I'm not a supporter of Hamas as such. I don't go out and rally for them and raise money for them or anything, but I do study them, like I study the Taliban, like I study the American white nationalist racists, like I study the American Christian Zionists, like I study any movement in the world that is a active political actor or military actor. So I study Hamas as a journalist. I'm not a full-fledged scholar, but what I do is I engage with scholars. And recently, my colleague Helena Coben, who's the publisher of uh, Just World Educational is the name of her group. They've published a lot of great books on many issues, many on the Middle East. So she and I decided that it really was important to help people understand what is Hamas without actively saying Hamas is totally right and we support it, etc. So the effort that I've been involved in with Helena, we invited 5 serious scholars of Hamas who have studied it in a serious, on-the-ground academic way for years and years, and we had 5 webinars with them. They're all on the website of Just World Educational, and then we found that these talks were so useful, so full of verifiable, serious knowledge that it was important to reach more people. So we edited them into a book, and the book has just come out. It's called Understanding Hamas and Why That Matters. I think you're going to get in the chat or an email a link to where you might get it if you'd like to order it or get your library to order it. It's very much worth reading. This is a very dispassionate, scholarly, but written for lay people account of what is Hamas, who are these people, what do they want, where do they came from, why do they do what they do. So understanding Hamas and Hamas, only came into being in 1987. It's not didn't come into the picture, in the 1930s or 40s or 60s or 70s. It was born in 1987 during the First Intifada. And it issued its first charter in 1988. So essentially, Hamas it came out of the Muslim Brotherhood movement, which is probably the biggest and most persistent social, political, cultural, religious movement across most of the Arab world. And it's a movement that advocates for Islamic values. It's not as harsh as say, the Taliban in Afghanistan or other such movements, but it is a very widespread movement that focuses on social values, cultural affairs, and has gotten into political activity when it was allowed to do so by the ruling powers, whether those be the British government years ago in colonial times or others. But it came out of the Gaza branch of the Palestine Gaza branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they put out their first charter in 1988. And they focused very much on social and cultural issues, family, education, healthcare, things like that, in the very early years of their existence, as most of these groups did. Hezbollah in Lebanon, similarly. I know both of these groups well. I've met some of their leaders. I've had interaction with their political and media people for many, many years in my work as a journalist in the Middle East, in Jordan, in Lebanon. So I've followed their work close up from their birth, because Hezbollah also was only born in the 1980s. And it's important to keep in mind that both Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Palestine were born out of the necessity by the Palestinian people on the Lebanese people to protect themselves from continued Israeli attacks or subjugation or threats or whatever in Lebanon or occupation. The Israelis occupied South Lebanon in 1982, and Hezbollah in Lebanon was born shortly after that, and the same thing with Hamas in Palestine. So these two movements organically came out of the Arab society as a response to Israeli actions that subjugated them or hurt them or killed them or whatever. I'm trying to use descriptive words, not too emotional, but Israeli policies generated the response of Hezbollah and Hamas and many other movements being created. So this is fascinating to keep in mind, because today, of course, the Israeli propaganda, which American mainstream politicians swallow and repeat like parrots, is that these are Iranian proxies. They're puppets of Iran. They do whatever Iran wants. Iran is the great evil force these days in many American eyes, and therefore Hamas and Hezbollah are simply tools of Iran, and this is not accurate. Again, I know Iran. I've been to Iran. I've spoken to Iranian leaders. I've followed these things intimately for the last 50 years as a journalist. There is a convergence between their political goals, but they were born. Hamas was born as a response to constant Israeli subjugation and occupation. Gaza has been occupied by Israel for about 57 years. The Israelis withdrew from Gaza, I think in 2005 was the Israeli withdrawal. But Israel still controls Gaza, the borders, the airspace, the water underground, the whatever, the sea access. So people living in Gaza are totally under this was before October 7th, now it's even worse. They were totally under Israeli control. And again, the Israeli line is, we withdrew in 2005. You should have invested your money in education and you'd be like Singapore. Of course, that's nonsense, because they didn't withdraw. They withdrew physically, but they made life for Palestinians in Gaza way more difficult. They controlled any imports into Gaza. They controlled the movement of people out of Gaza. People who needed healthcare couldn't get it there, had to leave. Israelis wouldn't let them. There are many things like that. Business, trade, investments. So the Israelis are still considered by international law. They are still considered the occupying power because they control the essential elements of normal life. But anyway, go back. So the birth of Hamas in the 1980s was the beginning of its political public life, and it started with heavy focus on social and human activities, education, healthcare, etc. And then after the first Intifada, which is when it was born, it started getting into political issues, which it had never done before. In 1988, it put out its first charter, which was very hard line and included elements that clearly were anti-Semitic, blaming the Jews for this and saying the Jews are that. And that was later revised because Hamas realized that this was not accepted internationally and therefore and was not accurate. Even if they felt this was the case, it isn't true to say that Jews do this or Jews do that. Zionist Israelis do this and do that in Palestine, but they changed the charter after that. I think it was in 2010 or 2000. I'll give you the date in a minute. So they then evolved over the years. And the important thing to acknowledge about Hamas is that from its birth in 1987 until today, it has continuously adjusted its policies, adjusted its rhetoric, adjusted its official positions in its statements. And by the way, you need to, if you're seriously looking at Hamas or any of these groups, you need to look at the official statements of the ruling or the power authority. Who's actually in charge? Who decides Hamas's policy? If you hear somebody on some radical Arab television station or some Western radical progressive station or some religious fanatical statement saying something crazy, you shouldn't take it seriously because that's not official policy. In the same way as, if, as happens often to me, a local taxi driver in New York or Boston says outrageous things about Black people or Hispanics or women or Arabs or whatever, and it says, "No, this is what all of us in the conservative in the conservative world feel. This is what the Trump people feel. This is what the Republican Party feels. Whatever." You can't make policy based on what you hear from individuals who are often extremists and usually outrageous in their statements. And this is exactly what the situation is with groups in the Arab world. The ability of Hamas to adjust and evolve over time is one of the most important factors that need to be understood. It changed its charter, and let me see what exactly that date was. In 2017, it issued a new charter, and it took away the anti-Semitic stuff. It clarified its position on many issues. And ever since 2010, that's 7 years before the charter was changed in 2017, it started talking about coexistence with the state of Israel. Before that, it said Israel cannot exist. It has to be eliminated. This is a Palestinian land, etc. That position clearly was not going to be accepted by the world and was not accepted by most of the Arab world, because the Arab world, as of 2002, had, in its Arab peace plan, had accepted to coexist with an Israeli state if the Israeli state withdrew to its pre-1967 borders and accepted to live next to a Palestinian state, which was supposed to be the outcome of the Oslo negotiations that started in 1993, but they never went anywhere for various reasons. Me and most people in the Arab world think it's because the Israelis were never seriously interested in negotiating a two-state solution. They just wanted to keep building settlements and increasing their control of the occupied lands, which history probably suggests is correct. If you look at what they're doing now, they're still building settlements in the West Bank. They did get out of Gaza, but they then kept attacking Gaza, and what they're doing now is pretty self-evident. But the movement, the change in the Hamas position, I think, is meaningful. And 6 or 7 times since 2006, when elections took place in Palestine, and the U.S. enthusiastically supported those elections, and Jimmy Carter's group was an observer, and everybody said the elections were very free and fair, and there were elections for parliament, and Hamas emerged as the winner in the West Bank, and therefore they became the controlling body, and they were the winner in the West Bank, but in Gaza and the West Bank, and therefore there was a government in Palestine very briefly for about 3 or 4 months in 2007 that had there was a joint government between Fatah and Hamas, and Ismail Haniyeh, who was just assassinated, was the prime minister of Palestine because he had won a parliamentary election, open, free, and fair, and he and the Fatah people, Mahmoud Abbas, made an agreement, reached agreement that Hamas would abide by any internationally accepted positions that the PLO had signed on to before, which essentially meant the Oslo Agreement, that the Palestinians would accept to live next to an Israeli Jewish state, as it is now, but the Palestinians had to get their state as well. So these historic turning points are ones that are important to understand. And in our book, the scholars who describe this go into great detail about this because they interviewed all the people they knew, the leaders and others. This evolution of Hamas's position went on at the same time as its military actions. So Hamas, the name Hamas is an acronym in Arabic for Al-Haraka al-Maqawama al-Islamiyya, which means the Islamic Resistance Movement. The key word in Hamas's name, in my view, is resistance. Islamic is an important adjective, but resistance is the dynamic. Well, it's the noun and a verb. They resist is what they do. They don't just propagate. They don't, explain things. They resist. And they resist by building better societies, educating their kids, improving their economy, and fighting militarily to defend themselves. And the fact that they grew over the years, while the Fatah-led, which had always been the biggest branch of Palestinian political life, while the Fatah people signed the Oslo Accord and essentially became adjuncts to the Israeli occupation to keep things quiet in the West Bank. And as the Israeli settlements continued for years and years, it was clear that Oslo was going nowhere. And then when the attacks happened all over Palestine, especially the attack by Baruch Goldstein in, I think it was, let's see, I can't remember the exact date of that again. I'll tell you in a minute. When Baruch Goldstein, a settler near Hebron, attacked the mosque there and killed 29 Palestinians. It was in 1994, just after the Oslo, a year after the Oslo Accord. When that happened, Hamas and others realized that this idea of a peaceful transition to two states wasn't going to work because the Israelis clearly were not going to push in that direction and allowed the settlers to do whatever they wanted, including massacring praying Palestinians in a mosque. So that's when Hamas started using suicide bombers, sending people into Israel with bombs strapped around them and exploding them in a bus or a pizza parlor. And this then accelerated the back and forth political action by the Israelis and the Palestinians and military responses, and made Hamas, in the eyes of the world and the eyes of the Israelis, made them primarily a terrorist group. Now, there's no doubt that some of the actions that Hamas undertook were terror acts. When you explode a bomb in a pizza parlor or a bus, that's a terror act. There's no doubt about it, and therefore we have to figure out how do we deal with that. And Hamas has various explanations, which sometimes sound reasonable, sometimes don't. For instance, they say that they've only attacked military targets in Israel, which is not correct if they're attacking buses and pizza parlors, which they did a few times, not that many. So clearly they've done terror acts, and therefore they should be held accountable. Everybody should be held accountable. But the problem we have historically, going back really to the beginning of this conflict in the 1920s, is that the Palestinians and the Israelis, or the Palestinians and the Zionists, have never been held accountable to the same degree or to the same legal and moral requirements. So if it's terrorism when Palestinians attack Israeli civilians, it should be terrorism when Israel, the government, attacks Palestinian civilians in huge numbers, much bigger numbers. This is often not, usually this is not the case. So most of the world will say, well, Israel has a right to defend itself. the Palestinians are terrorists. The Palestinians must accept Israel's legal existence before they can expect to get anything back from the Israelis in terms of coexistence. So this is a dilemma that's been going on for some decades now. And the point to keep in mind here is that what happened in October 2023, last year, this very severe attack into southern Israel by Hamas and some of its supporters and allied groups, was the latest and most dramatic, grave incident of the Israelis and the Palestinians fighting each other. If you don't see that as part of a century-long military struggle, then you're not being honest. You're not seriously trying to understand what's going on. If you only see, and again, the Israeli propaganda line, which the Western world largely parrots, including the American president and presidential candidates, they say Israel has a right to defend itself. Well, everybody has a right to defend themselves, but everybody also has a right to expect that all active military or political actors will be held accountable to the same set of rules and law, which is not the case. So Israel is allowed to do what it's doing now in Gaza, and people in the West, majorities of citizens in Europe, North America, are against the war and want an immediate ceasefire. About half of them want the arms embargo by Western suppliers to Israel. But the majority of citizens clearly want a ceasefire, stop this rampage, which the International Court of Justice has said is a plausible genocide. And the governments don't do anything, or they do very little symbolic things, like the British government stopped export licenses for about 10% of its military exports to Israel, which is nothing. It's just a symbolic, which is even worse than doing nothing, because it means you're play acting as a responsible government, that you're okay with the genocide, you keep supporting them. But this process of military and political interaction between Israel and Palestine has reached its highest point and most gruesome point now in the initial attack of October, which killed, there were 1,200 people were killed. Some were killed by Israeli fire, some were killed by, most were killed by Hamas, and some were killed by other Palestinians who were not Hamas, who went in, because it was pretty, pretty uncontrolled situation. Once the fence was broken through, all kinds of people went into Israel. And this is a situation that cries out for a serious international independent investigation. In every incident that happens between Palestinians and Israelis, any shooting, like shooting of American citizens, there was the one last week, the American-Turkish young lady who was shot, Shireen Abu Akleh, a couple of years ago, American-Palestinian journalist. In every one of these incidents, the world calls for, much of the world calls for an independent investigation. The Israelis never do it. They never accept anybody to come and investigate somebody that was killed by Israelis, whether the government or independent people or whatever. They always say they do the investigation, and then nothing very serious happens. So we're at this situation now where, after all these years of political and military struggle, Hamas has repeatedly offered, I think there were 7 different offers that were made. The first one was when Ismail Haniyeh in 2006, when he was elected, he became prime minister of Palestine. One of the first things he did is he wrote a letter to George Bush, the president, offering, and he was kind of cute. He was saying, well, as one democratically elected leader to another, we would like to engage with the United States about a peaceful resolution of our conflict with Israel. And this has since been clarified a little bit, but 7 times the Hamas has made these offers officially, formally, spoken in public by its leaders and in documents, saying that they could coexist with Israel, open-ended coexistence, if Israel withdrew from the occupied lands and worked for a resolution of the Palestine refugee issue. The Palestine refugee issue being mainly that when Israel was created in 1948, about 750,000 Palestinians were either driven out or fled during the war, and most of those Palestinian refugees many of them lived in camps, many of them, like our family, we just live a normal middle-class life. But many of them were destitute refugees, and most of the people in Gaza are refugees from 48 and their descendants. The Palestinians saying that if that refugee issue is resolved, and there's many ways to resolve it with repatriation, restitution, compensation, there's all kinds of ways that people resolve these conflicts equitably. Hamas has said we would be willing to coexist with Israel in its pre-1967 form. The important thing again here to recognize is that Hamas does not have massive support among Palestinians. Historically, Yasser Arafat and Fatah were the dominant movement, and there were other smaller political movements, some of them lefties, some of them middle of the road. Hamas stuck to its position after the Oslo Agreement of 1993 and said, no, we won't go along with Oslo because it's not fair. It doesn't include the basic right of the Palestinians to self-determination and to statehood. Oslo promised stages, and initially they withdrew a little bit, Israelis withdrew a little bit, Palestinians set up a government in Jericho and Gaza, but it didn't work, obviously, and Hamas then became more resolute in its resistance mode, and they carried out military resistance. They started developing small rockets. They had assistance from Iran, from Hezbollah, from all kinds of people, and they kept getting more and more proficient until they reached the point last year where they did what they did in October and have survived the last 11 months of this onslaught by Israel, and they're still there somewhere. We don't know where. They're probably in the tunnels or who knows. But they haven't been destroyed. The Israeli hostages have not been released, and the future of Hamas is not clear. We don't know if they're still in a position to be a serious political actor. All of this will be revealed one day when the fighting ends and we move on to the next phase. But what's important here is to recognize that the reason Hamas persists and became so strong is mainly for two reasons. And these are, if you keep in mind anything from my discussion today, let it be this. The two reasons that Hamas is important to understand and why people should engage it, people including the Israelis, the Americans, everybody. The reason is that it is the main resistance actor representing the Palestinians now. In fact, representing probably most of the people in the Arab world who support its position that Palestine must allow for the Palestinian land must include a Palestinian sovereign state, and we accept to live alongside an Israeli state. So the idea that the Israelis propagate that we want to destroy them, we want to throw them all into the sea, this is nonsense. There's been many a formal peace or coexistence offerings made, but that's one, that Palestine is the main resistance actor. The second reason, which is less well appreciated, is that the Hamas position on resisting actively until the Palestinians achieve liberation and statehood. liberation and statehood, liberation from Israeli occupation and their statehood. The details of those to be negotiated, but the principle is clear. That position coincides 100% with the position of all the main Palestinian political factions, Fatah and Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and Arab Liberation Front. There's a dozen of these groups, but Fatah is the only important one. But even Fatah is not important anymore because it's turned into a subcontractor for the Israeli occupation. And so the whole Palestine Liberation Organization governance system has to be restructured, rejuvenated, re-legitimized one day, and then you will have one Palestinian political leadership, including Hamas, because Hamas has tried for years to coordinate with the Fatah and be part of the national government, but the Fatah has always turned that down, and the US and the Israelis have always tried to block that as well. But the key point, my second key point, is that Hamas is strong among the Palestinian and Arab publics because it fully reflects their views about how we deal with the conflict with Israel. Do we give up and do what they want, like Fatah did? Do we keep fighting forever, which is not a practical solution given the imbalance in military power and the obvious Western support for Israel? Or do we try to find a negotiated resolution that satisfies Israel's right to statehood and sovereignty and peaceful existence and satisfies the Palestinian right? And I should add another point here, and I'll stop in a few minutes, which is that the support for this Hamas position reflects a really important element, which is more and more obvious today in the last 11 months of the Gaza thing, that there is huge international support for Palestinian rights. Let's just use that phrase. It doesn't mean there's huge international support for attacking, of sleeping families at night and abducting Israelis. This is the Israeli propaganda will tell you that, oh, if you talk about Hamas, it means you're supporting what they did in October of last year. No, that's not what we're supporting. We're supporting the determination of the Palestinian people to achieve their liberation and their sovereignty according to UN resolutions and international law through a negotiated resolution with Israel. This has clearly been the Palestinian and Hamas position. That's why it's so widely supported across the world. What the October attack and Israel's massive overkill response, genocidal response, has shown is that there is enormous support for Palestine rights all over the world, including in much of the Western world, especially among young people. And polling in the West again now clearly shows a change over time, where in the US and Europe that the small majorities of people want equal rights for Israelis and Palestinians. 30, 40 years ago, the Western world's polls would have shown 80% want Israel's position to be accepted and only 20%. But there's a change over time, and there's more Western support among the people, and a few governments, not very many, but a few governments like Spain and others, Norway. But this evolution over time of massive international support shows that the Palestine issue today, I mean, Gaza is the trigger for this, but it's the broader Palestinian rights issue, is the greatest political and moral movement in the entire world. There's no other movement. Women's rights, civil rights, climate change, worker rights, whatever, any movement you think of has international support, but none of them has reached this level of international support that the Palestinian movement has received, both in terms of public action like demonstrations in the street, or in terms of voting at the UN, things of that nature. And this is quite extraordinary. And I believe it unveils and reveals a really serious dimension of this conflict, which is controversial, but I've been supporting it for some time, and I think I still can do that with confidence. The Palestinians, the Arab region, and most of the world, especially the South, the global South, see this as the last anti-colonial struggle in the world. The colonial period lasted for 300-400 years. It devastated much of the global South, and many of the colonial dominations were ended through liberation wars, through resistance, through other means, except for the Israeli settler colonial domination of Palestine, which was directly helped and enabled by Great Britain, which was the dominant power in 1920, and now by the United States. And the world sees what the Palestinians are trying to do, the resistance, our desire to live peacefully with Israel, as the last anti-colonial struggle. And most of the world that did not have a chance to fight its own colonial battles is vicariously, I think, supporting the Palestinians and telling the Western colonial powers this tradition of Western colonial powers has to stop, and the people of the global South really need to have their rights, as well as the colonized dark-colored people in the global North. So Black people and Hispanics and others in the North also have their own issues, but that's something that they have to resolve within their own countries. So this is the situation that we're at today, broadly speaking. There are huge questions that have been raised now about what happens next, where do we go from here? I haven't mentioned any of these because I'd rather respond to any of your comments to make sure that I talk about issues that you're particularly interested in. Most of the issues related to what comes next, what do we do now, have no clear answer. So if anybody tells you this is what's going to happen or this is what's going to happen, don't believe them. It's all speculation or propaganda. But I will do my best to give you some suggestions, or some answers. My last point to summarize what I'm trying to say and what I'd like you to keep in mind, and I'd urge you to get the book, or you probably find it in the library soon. Is to say that in other battles around the world, the U.S. in particular, it battled the Viet Cong and then negotiated with them in Paris. It battled the Taliban and then negotiated with them in Doha. And it's battling Hamas, and it is already negotiating with Hamas for the exchange of prisoners and hostages, and it will negotiate with Hamas. Israel will negotiate with Hamas for a political resolution. This must happen at some point. The sooner that people sit with Hamas, and you can call them terrorists, you can call them fanatics, call them whatever you want. The important thing is to sit with them, understand exactly what do they mean when they say they're willing to coexist with Israel in peace. What do they mean by that? You have to get it from them, straight from them, not through media and stuff. Therefore, engaging Hamas directly and indirectly through proxies, do it any way you want, but you must talk to these people because they are the greatest, the most, the strongest and most important representative now of the sentiments of all Palestinians, all Arabs, and much of the entire world on the issue of we must resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through equal rights to statehood, sovereignty, and security for Israelis and for Palestinians simultaneously, not like Oslo's make-believe world where the Israelis pull out of a little area, Palestinians get a little control, and then see what happens later. So this is the point that I want to make, that these people are important. They have done bad things, and they should be held accountable, but holding them accountable means you have to also hold the Israelis and Arab governments and others, and the American government, accountable for their actions. So let me stop there, and I'd love to hear your comments and questions.
Okay, thank you, Rami. Before we begin the Q&A, you listed two key reasons that we should take with us, and I just want to reiterate those in case they went by too quickly. And Rami, you can correct me if I'm inaccurate. The first one was that Hamas is the main resistance actor representing Palestinians. And the second one is that Hamas will exist until liberation and statehood are achieved. Am I correct in those two?
Sort of. The first one is that Hamas is the main resistance actor that also reflects the political sentiments of all Palestinian movements
Yeah.
and all Palestinian people. Of Palestinians must have their rights alongside Israeli rights. That they are representative of the whole Palestinian Arab world. They're not just some freak terror group, which is what the Israelis and the American government tries to make you think they are.
Thank you for that clarification. And you're absolutely right. There is no other organization that represents what Palestinians want, and that is freedom. And thank you for that. I have a quick question, and if the answer is no, that's fine. I'm just curious. Do you have any direct contact with Hamas principals?
I have had and continue to have contacts with some of their people here and there, but mainly in my work as a journalist. I don't claim to be a conduit to Hamas thinking or Hezbollah thinking, but I've interacted with them. I've met with top people like Khalid Mishal, for instance, who headed the movement for years in Amman. When I lived in Amman and the Israelis tried to kill him, they poisoned him. And when he was saved with the antidote that King Hussein forced the Israelis to send him, I went and interviewed him twice and had long chats with him. And the Hezbollah people, similarly, I've met some of their senior political people over the years and the people in charge of their media operations and both of them. So I have had contacts with senior Hamas and Hezbollah people, but that's what you have to do as a serious journalist to get it from the horse's mouth.
Yes, and I asked the question not because I wanted to connect you in any direct way with Hamas. I was just curious as to that, and so you answered it. Thank you. All right, we'll get to the Q&A that our audience has posed to us. The first one came prior to today. Is Hamas associated with ISIS, and if so, how?
No, Hamas is not associated with ISIS at all. And this is fascinating because one of the things I'm doing is a study of 100 years of Israeli propaganda and talking points. And I've been documenting for the last year and a half that I've been in the US. And this is one of their key, the Israelis and Zionists before them have done this for most of the last century. Their foes in the region. Now it's Hamas. Before it was Arafat. Before that it was Saddam Hussein. Before that it was somebody else. They will associate their foes, their enemies, with the worst evil thing in the world to convince the Western world that the Israelis' opponents, let's say, Hamas, is like Qaeda, is like ISIS, is like the Nazis. Before they used to say Arafat was supporter of Saddam Hussein when Saddam Hussein was the great evil. Or now they say that these are proxies of Iran. Iran is seen as the great evil. And the Western view of Iran is incredibly distorted and unrealistic, I think. But the answer is no, they don't have any links. They're nothing like ISIS. And they have tremendous support because they are genuine and they represent a valid political position.
Thank you. Could Hamas as a political organization change its name and evolve into something that would not be immediately discounted?
They would never do that. I mean, they don't want to play the American CNN cartoons game. this is what the West does. The way the Western world, broadly speaking, people like you are an exception because you're trying to get the real facts if you can. But broadly speaking, in the Western world, people deal with cartoon-like imagery, good guys, bad guys, no. The answer is they would not change the name. But more important is they change their position. When they changed their charter and when they repeatedly made appeals or not appeals, overtures to the United States government, to the Israelis, to others, for a negotiated resolution of this conflict, they were totally rebuffed. The Israelis and Americans would not respond at all. When the Arab League, representing all 22 Arab countries, made the Arab Peace Plan in 2002, I think it was, 2002 or 2003, all the Arab countries and 57 Islamic majority countries with them offered to the Israelis coexistence, permanent peaceful coexistence, open borders, trade, whatever end of conflict. If the Israelis would withdraw from the lands they occupied in 1967 and live next to a Palestinian state and resolve the refugee issue in a negotiated manner that satisfies both sides. In other words, nothing was going to be imposed on the Israelis. And the Israelis and Americans have never responded to the Arab Peace Initiative, which has been repeated several times. The only conclusion that reasonable people can make is that the Israelis and Americans do not want a two-state resolution. They're perfectly happy with Israeli domination of the Palestinian land and people. That's why this attack in Gaza continues with direct, enthusiastic American support, American government support. And that's why I say the signs are so clear that what we're dealing with here is the last anti-colonial battle in the world. And that's why people are so hysterical in the West, to the point of here in the US, when I watch what the pro-Israeli zealots are doing and the lobby, AIPAC and others, they're trying to get the Congress now to criminalize any activity on campus that deals with Palestine. Like if a professor teaches a course on Palestine history or something, they want that professor removed, or they want somebody who's going to come and give a talk on campus. They say, no, that you can't do that. That's not allowed. It's unbelievable how hysterical has become the pro-Israeli movement in the United States, both by groups linked directly to Israel, like AIPAC and others, but also by American politicians and independent American groups who are not linked to Israel, but are afraid of going against what Israel wants for various reasons, which is for another topic. But I would urge anybody who's really interested in this to buy or go to the library and read this unbelievable new book, which I'm reading now, by Ilan Pappé, P-A-P-P-E, Ilan, I-L-A-N, Pappé, P-A-P-P-E. He's an Israeli historian, and he's written this book called Lobbying for Israel on Both Sides of the Atlantic. It's a monumental 450-page history of how the Zionist groups and then the State of Israel have lobbied in the UK and the US to get their views accepted and continue to do so today. And the consequence is what we see today. It's an unbelievable, deep view into how Israel has been able to get away with everything that it's done, even though it breaks every international law available and doesn't get held accountable. The impact of the Israeli lobbying is one of the structural bases for the success of the Israeli state. But the problem is that the success of the Israeli state is not only in creating a state where Jews can live, but creating a state that is increasingly seen by the world like the state of apartheid South Africa, and is being increasingly treated as a pariah state and an apartheid and racist state, with punishments and sanctions and this. Very slowly, we're seeing Israel moving into that terrible, terrible territory. I would not want to be an Israeli in a situation where Israel is going to be like apartheid South Africa. But that's what's slowly happening, and it's because the Israeli lobby has gone overboard, the pro-Israel lobby. And I would really recommend that book by Ilan Pappé.
Thank you, Rami. What is the status of China, of the China-supported reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah?
It's not getting any serious publicity, and I think that's because it hasn't achieved any serious substantive outcomes yet. The Chinese have always been very careful not to do anything, not to take an initiative unless they think it's going to succeed. They're very cautious. They don't see themselves as a diplomatic power. They see themselves as an economic power. Increasingly, they have military dimensions to their world engagements, but mostly it's to protect their economic trading links, sea routes, things like that. So they haven't seriously been engaged. This attempt they did about a month ago or so to get Fatah and Hamas to come to Beijing and try to negotiate a resolution to have a single Palestinian government is very noble, and I fully support it. But we don't know behind the scenes what they are offering. And my guess is, and this is a purely a guess, is what they're saying is, look, once the fighting stops, the Chinese will step in to be part of an international global mediation effort or something like that. That's my guess. But that would require a single Palestinian government. There are also many attempts by Palestinians, credible, serious Palestinians of all political views in Palestine, around the Arab region, around the world, here in the West, constantly meeting together to talk about the governance of Palestine after the fighting in Gaza ends, the day after, as it's called. There has to be a credible, legitimate, and inclusive Palestinian government in Palestine that really reflects Palestinian sentiments, which the old government of Arafat in his fading years, and then Mahmoud Abbas now, they don't reflect anybody's views at all. They're totally irrelevant. They're actually quite embarrassing. And 80% of Palestinians want them to resign. So the new government, reconstituted national legitimate leadership, is the single biggest Palestinian priority after getting a ceasefire. But the ceasefire is really up to Hamas. The other Arab countries have really no impact on that, as far as I can tell.
My guess is when the fighting does stop and then there is a necessary rebuilding to be done, then China will step in and offer all kinds of rebuilding assistance and therefore gain favor that way. That's what they typically do.
Yes, and
very successful.
That's perfectly legitimate as long as it corresponds or coincides with Palestinian identified national priorities. Yes, I'm all for it.
Okay, we'll go to some questions that were asked today. What do you think Hamas hoped to accomplish last October? Did they ever think the war would last this long?
I don't think they expected the intensity and the duration of the response they got from Israel. I think they expected more, they expected severe response because 4 or 5 times in the last 20 years, the Israelis have gone into Gaza when they occupied it, and even when they didn't after 2005, they've gone in and done massive military destruction from the air and on the ground, and wiping out entire neighborhoods. They've done this several times, and it hasn't worked. I mean, the Israelis are Jews and Israelis are smart people, generally speaking.
We know that.
Yeah, they are, and I know from my many Jewish and Israeli friends, they can be brilliant people, and like everybody else in the world, they have emotions, and sometimes their emotions drive them into excesses. And one of the excesses we see in the Israeli government, I'm not talking about Jews here, I'm talking about the Israeli government, is the excess of thinking that massive military action against Palestinians, to the point where the ICJ calls it plausible genocide, that will make the Palestinians give up, lie down, and go home. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. Human history best exemplified by the Jewish people themselves. Best exemplified by the Jewish people themselves since the Hebrews exile in Babylon, if you take the Bible as literally true, but let's say it is. Since the Babylonian exile and the second exile and all the suffering that they've had in racist Europe, they kept struggling, and they achieved their state. They don't understand that all human beings are like Jewish people, that if they're subjugated, they're going to resist. If they're occupied, they're going to fight for liberation. If they're denied their rights, they're going to struggle for them in every means possible. And by the way, the United Nations has several times clarified that occupied people have a right to resist, is what the UN said in a resolution in 1974. And they clarified this in 1982 when the UN said that, let me read you the sentence, that the UN resolution in 1982 said that the legitimacy of the struggle of people for independence, territorial integrity, national unity, and liberation from colonial and foreign domination and foreign occupation by all available means, including armed struggle. So they specified, including armed struggle. If you're fighting occupation and domination by a foreign power, you can use military means against armed targets, not against civilians. And this is where the complexities come in now with the various ways that the Israelis attack and the way Hamas attack, that civilians are killed, but military people are killed too. So this is for an investigative unit from the world to figure out. So people like me and you can talk about this till the cows come home. And it doesn't have much power because you need to have a verified investigation of, how these civilians were killed on both sides and how military action was legitimate. The military action Israel took, they claim, is in self-defense. So is that correct or not? Let's get an international investigation to tell us. And if the Palestinians, like Hamas and others, attack Israeli military units, which is what their plan was in October 7, is that legitimate according to the international law? We can each give our views, but we need really an independent, serious international investigation, which the Israelis will never allow. The Israelis will never allow this because they know that what they're doing won't pass the test of legitimacy of international law. What the Palestinians, what Hamas wanted to do, they wanted to radically shake up the complacent global and Middle Eastern and Israeli situation that had prevailed for the last 57 years, that these occupied Palestinians are being mistreated, dehumanized in so many ways, and the world was not really doing anything about it. And Hamas simply couldn't allow that to continue forever. So they kind of, as one of the scholars in our book says, they sort of rolled the dice. They knew that something bad was going to happen in retaliation by Israel, but they couldn't be exactly sure what. But they also didn't expect to achieve what they did. They didn't know there was a musical festival. They were attacking targets that they saw as military targets, settlements and military outposts. This is Hamas's view. You can accept it or not accept it, but you need to know it. And so there is this legitimate debate about what happened in October that is seen by law to be legitimate and what happened that is not legitimate. And again, I say all sides, Israel, the US, Hamas, anybody else, has to be held accountable according to the same single standards of morality and law. And if you don't apply this single standard to everybody, then you're no better than just a warmongering propagandist.
Thank you. These are two questions that I'm going to ask as one. Would you please comment on a one-state solution supported by Pape, Kimsaya, Helper, all three of whom have been forum speakers, by the way, et al. And what do you think is more feasible, a one-state or a two-state solution? What are pros and cons of each? That's a biggie. That's another forum.
It is. We've been debating it for, the last 57 years, since 67. It's impossible to see a one-state solution now, given the recent history and the animosity and anger and the bad blood that's been spilled on both sides. A two-state solution is really difficult, but less difficult than a one-state solution. So I would argue for an internationally supervised, not like the Oslo Accord that was overseen by implementation of the accord was overseen by the US. The actual accord was overseen by the Norwegians. But an international serious mediation that outlines the two-state solution as the goal and outlines and supervises the removal or reduction of some Israeli settlements throughout the West Bank. And the big Israeli settlements right along the border, the 67 border, there's a couple of 100,000 people there. They're obviously not going to be moved, so there would be land swaps. And the Palestinians have already accepted this. That's why the phrase that's always thrown into the negotiation parameters is mutually acceptable negotiated agreements. So you leave some Israelis, a lot of Israeli settlers east of the 67 line, and in return, the Palestinians will get lands probably in the Galilee area or in the south of equal value, which is important, that we don't give them the great belt around Jerusalem in return for some desert in the south. Land of equal value would be given by Israel to the Palestinian state. And this would probably include a corridor between Gaza and the West Bank and other things like that. So I think aiming for a two-state resolution initially is more realistic, but will only happen with massive international engagement in the negotiating process and the implementation process. In other words, what I'm saying is what we need to end this conflict is to, for the first time in the 100 years of this conflict, what we need is to define Zionism. We need to define it not as the Zionists themselves define it, the right to live in a state where Jews can live peacefully. We accept that. What we need to know is what are the borders of this state? What are the demographic and geographic borders, limits of that state? And how much right does that state have to go around attacking people and laying siege to people because it claims it's insecure? So we need the physical, demographic, and geographic and political definition of Zionism. And this is a really tough thing to do, but I believe if it offers the Jewish citizens of Israel and all supporters of Israel around the world, if it offers them a guarantees, internationally guaranteed certitude of sovereignty, security, stability, and statehood for the state of Israel and the people, the Jewish people who want to go live there, I believe they would accept it because they have their state now, they have their sovereignty, but it's the most dangerous place in the world for Jews to live because of what's going on. And we see it today. So that's my long answer to a short question.
Let's see. Where can we find statements made directly from Hamas?
They have official spokespeople who put out. They have websites that you can look at. And if you go to the appendix for our book, in the back, we put a lot of reference materials for students and interested people that tell you more about all of the details about Hamas and what it is and what it does. They have an official spokesperson now during the Gaza fighting who puts out statements about the negotiations, etc. But they're getting much better at engaging the world through diplomacy and media and communications.
Let's see here. Thank you. How does the PLO government become effective? There must be leadership. Are there any individuals who are up to the task?
There's a couple of hundred individuals who are up to the task to be head of the PLO. Anybody who knows Palestine and has been to Palestine or knows Palestinians around the world knows that we are a very talented people, like every other people in the world. There's nothing about us that's different than Jews or Israelis or Syrians or Nicaraguans or anybody else. We have hundreds of superb people who are doctors and professors and journalists and lawyers and farmers and whatever. So there's no lack of really able Palestinians, and you can see that in the development of Palestinian institutions, universities, businesses, whatever. The problem is that the political culture in Palestine has been devastated by the conflict of the last 100 years, deliberate Zionist and British interference in Palestinian life before 1948, and deliberate Israeli state and American interference in Palestinian life after 1948. And this is still going on, where the Americans and the Israelis are still looking for people, these elusive ghost-like beings who can suddenly emerge and be representatives of the Palestinian people. In other words, to become stooges of the Israelis and the Americans. They've tried this before many times. They tried it in southern Lebanon after 1982 when they occupied southern Lebanon. They tried it early on in the occupation of the West Bank. They had a thing called the Village Leagues, where they tried to get some hapless farmers who were in bad shape and offer them some money and say, hey, would you be part of a council to run the West Bank? They're trying it now to find among Gaza families, tribal leaders, they call them, or family leaders. This is what colonial occupation does. It distorts the normal thinking of normal human beings, and it allows the people who are powerful militarily to live in a delusionary world where they feel they can go in and manipulate the people that they occupy and create any make-believe fantasy world they want. It's like a computer game, let's put these people together and bring this, and there you go. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. The difference between computer games and real life is that human beings all over the world have the exact same mechanism for defining their dignity, their self-respect, and their national rights. There's no difference between what the Vietnamese did, what the under the French and the Americans, what the Indians did under the British, what the Algerians did under the French, what the Black South Africans did under the apartheid government, and what we're doing, the Palestinians, under the Israeli-American colonial onslaught. No difference at all. We're all, this is what makes people people. This is what differentiates humans from cats. We feel and think the same way because there is a biological and psychological and emotional imperative to a decent life. We don't want to occupy anybody else. We just don't want to be occupied by somebody else. We don't want somebody else to tell us who we are and what we can say or what we can wear or what we can eat or where we can travel. We just want to live like normal human beings, which is exactly what the Jewish Zionists wanted to do in the late 19th century and succeeded in doing it through various means, most of which were today would be seen as criminal and immoral. But still, it happened back then. So this is what the Palestinians are demanding now, which is that we set up our own credible governance system, which we know we can do. We have dozens and dozens of highly qualified people, many of whom are in jail in Israel. Marwan Barghouti is the main person who is seen to be a serious candidate to be the next Palestinian president who would unite all Palestinians, including Hamas. But he's in jail. The Israelis don't want to let him out. But they may be forced to. The negotiations are trying to get him to be one of the Palestinians released. So we'll just have to give it time. But people are working on this on the Palestinian side very diligently now, so that we're ready and not caught off guard like happened throughout the last century, where suddenly the Zionists or the Israelis or the British or the Americans come up with this ridiculous proposal, but they impose it because we're not organized enough to resist it.
Thank you. So many things pop into my head, but the Israelis, this is a long comment. The Israelis and the Americans should be nowhere near the negotiating table because they are dishonest, illegal, and unethical players in this whole affair. No one from the West should be present, only negotiators from the global South. Otherwise, they will railroad the Palestinian people like they have done over the last 100 years. If Hamas is not present, the whole process is a sham. Please comment, Rami.
I agree with the spirit of that statement, but I would adjust it a little bit. You have to have the Western world involved, but you cannot have the Western world leading the process. This is why all the peace attempts, negotiation attempts of the last 40 years have gotten nowhere, because you had the Kissinger approach, and then you had the Dennis Ross approach, and now you have, then you had the outrageous Jared Kushner approach, and now you have the latest attempt by the Biden administration. You can't have the U.S. be in the leadership position because they're not honest, they're not dispassionate, they're not fair, and they don't care about they don't really care about Palestinian lives. No matter what Kamala Harris says or Joe Biden says, you judge people by their actions. The American actions of the last 50 years show that the United States is perfectly happy to see the Palestinians subjugated to this relentless onslaught that dehumanizes them, and effectively wants the Palestinians to disappear from history, physically disappear, kill them, throw them out into the desert, scatter them all over the world. But it won't happen. It simply won't happen because we're aware of the reality now. We may not be able to stop the slaughter in Gaza right now. More and more people will die. But one of the things that we need to be aware of, difficult and painful as it is to acknowledge that no liberation struggle in the world has succeeded without a lot of people suffering and dying. And that's something that's very hard to acknowledge, but it's a fact. And this is part of Hamas's philosophy, that you have to resist by any means possible. You know it's probably going to result in your death, but this is the way that you set the stage for future generations of your people to live a normal and decent life. And so the Americans and the people in the West need to be involved, but not to be in control. And this is critical for the Israelis won't do anything unless the Americans are there. And the Palestinians won't do anything if only the Americans are there. So this combination of the Chinese, the Turks, the Russians, the Europeans, we need to have a serious group of countries working together to push any kind of process that leads to a full ceasefire, reconstituting a Palestinian government, and then negotiating for a permanent resolution of the conflict.
Thank you. And thank you for all of these questions. To our audience, thank you. And to you, Rami, for your incredibly cogent responses.